All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to a balanced weather video that we're doing here on a Thursday evening. And I'm very excited to welcome our guest tonight, Tom Weber, who is the author of the book Cloud Warriors, which is a book that I was excited to read a few weeks ago and really enjoyed it. Yes, let's see it. Let's see it. Awesome. I gave it a 5-star review on Goodreads. Really enjoyed it as, obviously I'm a meteorologist, but I learned a lot reading it, particularly about some of the topics that I'm not as familiar with, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I just want to give a real brief intro of Tom and then let him go into a little more detail. So Tom has a very distinguished journalism background, having been a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and an editor there, and also an editor at Newsweek and the Daily Beast, and an executive editor at Time, which is, as somebody who has gotten into writing in the last 6 months in Substack, that all is very impressive to me. So I guess first question I was going to ask Tom is, with somebody with that background, what brought you to the idea of working on a book about meteorology?
Sure. Well, first, I just wanted to say thank you for doing this, and also thank you for your newsletter, which I think is just terrific and a real service. I just, both in terms of the ways you're keeping track of everything that's going on happening to NOAA, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit, but also just a great way to keep up with the most interesting weather too. So I sort of enjoy when I get both. I get sort of the news developments, but also the most interesting weather. So thank you for your work doing that. So how did I get interested in weather and meteorology? I would ask almost everyone I interviewed for the book that question. And as you might imagine, because I was mostly speaking to meteorologists, I'm going to say 95% of people were like, well, when I was a kid, I got interested in the weather. I'm not quite like that. Growing up in Michigan, I was fascinated by tornadoes, but I was just more generally a tech geek, a computer geek, a space geek. So I was just always interested in science and technology. When I was at the Wall Street Journal in the late 90s, I covered sort of the explosion of internet companies. And my interest in coverage was, what does this technology mean for us as people and as a society? And then I spent a lot of years as an editor, which kept me from doing my own writing. Although I will say, looking back, one moment relevant here was May 2013. I found myself editing the cover story of Time magazine that week about the EF5 in Moore, Oklahoma. And it was interesting later when I visited the offices in Norman, and I saw a framed copy of that cover that I had worked on hanging on the wall. And after that, I spent a lot of time thinking about how I personally look to the weather forecast every single day. I mean, at least once a day, like most people. But I didn't really understand how it gets produced, which felt surprising to me because I usually gravitate towards the science and tech behind these things. And so that got me interested, and I started poking around, and I just kind of got addicted. And for me as a writer, it had this same sort of valence as covering the internet did, which is there's really interesting technology and really complicated science, but there's also this enormous human factor with impact for society, and ultimately, it's what you put all this science and tech to work for, that I think most people, ultimately care about. And so I would say that's more than you wanted to know about what got me interested in weather.
No, that's really interesting. And one of the things I was going to mention, and alluded to this. One of the things that I really appreciated about your book was that you spent a chapter just basically kind of talking about how the forecast is assembled, looking, kind of doing a deep dive into what a local weather service office does. You visited the state college office, and, was that something that you really wanted to ensure was part of the story?
It was, and it wasn't in my initial list. It was after I actually wound up spending that time in the WFO in State College, and to some extent also some time I spent at NSSL also before that. My original plan, and if you had my book proposal, it's like, oh, each chapter is going to focus on the forecasting of a different type of weather threat, starting with threats that develop instantly, like, or on a short time scale, like a tornado, and then, going out further in time to hurricanes, and then going out as far as subseasonal and seasonal forecasting and droughts and, rainy seasons and things like that. And, everything until you start hitting, kind of climate versus weather. And then, I had this experience of getting to spend time in that local office and really just observe and understand the work there. And I was like, oh no, this does not fit into my framework that and then I was like, heck with it. I'm gonna devote a chapter to how your local forecast gets produced. And if it breaks the logic of the ever lengthening timescales a little bit, then so be it. And in the end, it's as a reporter, and one thing that's really hard for young journalists, I know these days, because of budgets and financial pressures. I mean, I'm fortunate. I came up at a time when going in the field and seeing everything firsthand was, not only considered indispensable, but it was, it was consistently supported. When I was working at the Journal, I always remember the managing editor, this legendary editor of the Journal, Paul Steiger, came by my desk one day and he said, "Now you're starting this column. I just want you to know there's no expense report that I won't sign. You just go where you think the stories are." And in the sort of, internet information age, a lot of people are tied to their desks. They're doing Zooms. And so every chance I got to go meet people in person and watch their work in doing this book was, that's the fuel for me in trying to pull something together.
That's really interesting. It's interesting to me personally because, to be honest, I've actually been working on a book proposal, and so it's very interesting for me to hear you say that because, that's obviously, this is a new thing for me, and that's one of the things I've been wondering was, okay, well, once you do this, how beholden are you to it if your research takes you a different direction? So, I don't want to go down that road too far, but just for me, maybe at some point I can follow up with you and talk with you a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that actually, that was, you kind of answered what I actually had kind of jotted down as a question, which was, how did you come to the framework of the book, which, like you said, it starts with tornadoes and then kind of works its way toward subseasonal. But you pretty much described, how you got to that process.
Well, everybody, I mean, in journalism and especially, I mean, it's funny. I've worked at pretty much every scale of length now. I worked at a wire service where I would have to pound out these, you would pound out a 2-line headline and send it off, and then you would pound out like 100 words and send it off. And then, I've worked at newspapers where you might do 500 words or 1,000 words, and at time a cover story could be 3,000, 4,000, 8,000 words. And now this is, like 985 or 90,000. So anytime you get above that sort of, 500 word newspaper story, short newspaper story length, you're looking for an organizing principle, that'll help the reader feel like they have a map that's
Right.
going to lead them through, whatever it is you're reading. And, I don't know how successful I was at actually doing it, but I knew I needed one, and that, how do we divide this up? And it was also interesting from my research, the extent to which the work of forecasting actually differed when you were talking about different timescales. And again, I had the chance to spend time at NSSL during the spring experiment one year, and just sit over the meteorologists who had come in from some of the different offices to participate, and watch them doing real time, but kind of in the sandbox, tornado warning work. And then, I wound up, I spent some time at GFDL. I went to the ECMWF, which was really fun. It was just like being on a really cool campus for like just that feeling, because they're not at the facility. It's just, it's really just them and their modeling
Right.
work. And so, it was interesting for me to see how the work actually differed in, severe thunderstorms and tornadoes versus out to hurricanes and global models, and then out to, subseasonal. So, it's I started with the structure, and I tried to stick with it, but I did break it a little bit for that local forecasting. And also, I wound up spending some time on people doing hyper local forecasting work. There's a lot of interest in that in the private enterprise world for applications like drone flights and things like that. And I kind of broke that off too, which again broke the schema. But I just thought this is going to be something that hopefully people will find interesting moving forward. So I went ahead and did that too.
Well, I'll just say from my perspective, I found that very interesting, because I think that that's an area that's really a growth area, for lack of a better phrase, for the weather community. And Ken Howard is on this call. He was one of my colleagues at NSSL who retired at the same time I did, and he and I have talked before about the importance of like you're saying, the important, Amazon is going to need this hyper local information for drone flights and things like that, and how that's going to drive the meteorological community, not just forecasting, but the observing. And one of the things that we worked on together before we left was working with ClimaVision on some of their, localized X-band gap filling radars. And I guess that would be kind of my next question for you, is having gone through all of this experience in the research and putting the book together, where do you see meteorology going? Do you think that this hyper local is going to be kind of the next main focus area for the community?
I mean, I think on the business side, it seems like there's definitely going to be interest there, because it does feel like it's a new tool that whether you're doing airport operations, or maybe and maybe maybe the clients aren't private. I think if you're a state DOT and you can get a more fine-grained picture of icing and snowfall and things like that when you're trying to deploy your limited resources. I see a lot of potential there, but I also feel like, when kind of the average user, average consumer talks to me about it or has read the book and talks about it, and it's like, oh, this is good because I'm going to know, exactly at my office it's going to start raining at 4:52, or a week from now I'll know whether to hold the birthday party. I'm like, no, a week from now. Like that's you're not the target customer for this this kind of forecasting, as cool as it is. But I guess as a one-time Wall Street Journal reporter, one thing you kind of get trained to do is try to look where the money is headed. And so seeing some of the money headed into hyperlocal, both the serving up the actual forecasting, but as you were saying, also starting to figure out how to get better observations and have the data that can feed into the models and make them hopefully accurate enough. I feel like you're seeing money go into both of those, and that to me is a sign that somebody sees some some potential there. But obviously, we're at a moment, to me anyway, where the big picture is so much more complicated and daunting to even try to imagine where we're headed with U.S. leadership in forecasting. And I wish I should be asking you some questions.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because I and maybe it'll be more of a conversation, but obviously that's an area. I talked to a CNN producer today who's working on a potential kind of short form documentary on some of the things that are going on with NOAA and some of the potential risks, threats that are happening. And so obviously when you wrote this book, you didn't know what was in store. I'm sure you had some thoughts about that there were two kind of different directions it could go. And I actually think I may have interacted with, we may have had a blue sky exchange about this, that reading your book was I enjoyed it, but I also felt, kind of some sadness, because I felt like, there's so much exciting stuff that you talk about in the book that's happening, and, how much of it is going to be derailed by what's going on right now in our government. And I guess to kind of start the conversation, I'm curious as to, what your perspectives are on that.
Well, I mean, very much what you just said, which and just, for anybody that winds up taking a look at the book, on book publishing timeframes, I had to have everything finished last summer, and fact checked and copy edited and run through the lawyers and all of that. And so, I knew this was. I knew there was an election coming up that might have some consequences, and I sort of rested back the manuscript, for about a week, in the fall, to try to at least put some foreshadowing in, depending on the outcome of the election, and just basically get the words Project 2025 into the book, a couple of times, and at the time, I think my feeling was, well, look, there is what aggressive budget cutters and sort of anti-federal government voices want to do. But at the same time, surely, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, if you represent a local area, if you are a congressperson in the U.S. House of Representatives, you know what the impact on your constituency is from the weather. So surely there will be some tension between people wanting to, with these grand plans in Project 2025 to make massive cuts, and people who, answer to their constituents back home, and whether that's in Oklahoma where there's tornadoes, or Florida, people living in coastal areas in Florida at risk of hurricanes. And I think maybe the most surprising thing to me has been the extent to which we haven't seen much of that tension in play. And I suspect you're probably running into some of this every time you are trying to assess what's going on. It feels like, there's so much chaos. We're cutting jobs, we're restoring jobs. A program is getting defunded. At the same time, the next year's federal budget proposals, it looks like there's bipartisan support for not going crazy when it comes to NOAA. But we can't depend on the White House to actually spend the money that Congress authorizes now. And so even trying to look out a year feels so confusing. It almost feels like the chaos is part of the is part of the design. I guess when I try to stay optimistic, I think to myself, okay, I think we now have enough experience to see that politically, and again, I'm just going to hypothesize, some GOP representative from a red state that is impacted by weather,
Oklahoma, say,
have very much. And I guess what we've seen is that if you openly disagree with the president or his top officials, you get targeted, whether it's with a threat about being primaried, or social media, or you become the story of the day on Fox News. And so it feels a little bit like if you're in the GOP and you want to support funding for NOAA because that's what you need to do right by your constituents, it's almost like your best bet is to lay as low as possible and try to keep the topic out of sight as much as possible, because any sort of open disagreement is has the potential to be so counterproductive. But again, for me, that just makes it even harder to figure out where things stand. I guess one thing, this was kind of a question I had for you too, from your perspective. Obviously, it's hard to even get the weather enterprise story on the radar when there are,
right?
is I live in New York City. Am I going to be seeing the National Guard on the street when I go to the subway next month? I don't know. There's so many of these stories going on. One point where it seemed like the story did break through with the public about NOAA and the Weather Service was after the floods in Texas, and the media was asking questions and trying to figure out the forecast versus what happened with the local officials and all of that. And it felt to me, and when you would watch some of these segments too, where they talk to local people, that the public can understand, I think, that you need to have your operational forecasters on duty 24/7 in your forecast office. And so it seems like some of the undoing of the cuts may reflect that public sentiment, and kind of reflecting back up into the government. But my worry now is where the big risks for the future are, and not to dismiss the risk of just cuts to the operational forecasting, but the attacks on universities and the impact on academic funding. And that's a much harder story to tell to the public, I think, because I'm not sure. I would like it if they would read my book and understand, you know, where the academic world fits in to the weather enterprise. I guess what I'm saying is that I think people get that you need the forecasters on duty, and maybe when there's a story about bad weather, you know, they can respond to that. I think it's much harder to tell them how the future improvements in forecasts and in warning come from the cooperative efforts between universities and NOAA and the co-ops, you know, that have been, you know, an integral part of this, you know, for many years now, are either being shut down or at risk. And that's coming at it even from kind of the attacking NOAA side. What happens when we start figuring in just, you know, if University X is the university that's being targeted for whatever reason, you know, do this, or we're taking away all your funding. And so one thing I hope people would take away from the book is how hard fought all of our progress has been so far. And, you know, part of that comes from, you know, having great, you know, cooperation at some of the research, the NOAA research facilities and the academic world. And I don't know what I wanted to talk less and hear more from you on that, because I don't know how much that message is making it through.
I don't either. It's certainly a message that I'm trying to convey, and you know, particularly some of the NOAA folks that have retired in, you know, the last 6 months that are more on the research side, I know have been trying to get that story out too. And one of the things that I think is hard for people to understand is that, and I guess part of it is just, you know, at a basic level, I don't think people really understand. Well, obviously, they don't understand the complexity that goes into just making a forecast. I mean, you know, the huge infrastructure that underlies, you know, the radar network and the satellite network and the supercomputers and all of that, and which is why I think a book like yours is so important, because it does, you know, get to that story, and I think conveys the, you know, the complexity and the you know, just how large all of just the operational effort is, and then the research on top of that. And you know, you know, you were talking about all of the you know, the kind of uncertainties, things being on again and off again. This whole thing that's going on right now with the phased array radar, to me, is a prime example of that, in that when the you know, when OMB put out their initial budget, that was the one thing that they kind of saved out of OAR was, you know, we're going to keep the phased array radar research and we're going to move that to the Weather Service. And then, you know, that's the first thing that they kind of axe. And I realize there's a reason why. There was a procurement pending and they had to make a decision on whether or not they were going to move forward with that. But still, and then on the flip side, you look at the House bill, and it basically has direct language in there. You're going to spend the $75 million on a phased array radar instrument. So you just, you know, and these projects, I mean, phased
how would
array
you like
radar,
to be the vendor? How would you like to be
right,
the vendor, knowing what the situation is right now, and that level of uncertainty?
Right. Who's going to be what vendor is going to be sitting around counting on that $75 million contract? And at a practical, like laboratory level for the folks here at NSSL and at OU, for at least for the short term, there's some inertia that will go on, and obviously they still have the research radar we have now. They can continue to gather data with that, but at some point you're just kind of left in this weird limbo space. And if you're a scientist working on that, do you keep working on that with the hope that the funding is going to be restored, or do you start looking for
do you responsibly let a grad student
right
take that on as for their dissertation or what? I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of the world of academia there, but who's going to want to work on things
right
when there's uncertainty?
Yeah, and I talked about that at this. We had a public radio forum thing about NOAA here locally last week, and I was on the panel, and I talked about that. Again, it's one of those things that and there's no reason for the public to think about this stuff, so I don't expect that they do. But people who get their graduate degrees, that's how they get it, is by having a research project that they can work on. And for most of the people at OU, it's government funded research. It's something that NSSL or NOAA needs research done on. And from what I understand, they're already down 20% in grad students for this year. That's just going to keep, eventually there's an erosion here that you can't recover from. And I wonder how much of what's going on with, some of the, with what happened with all of the people that were let go and left from, the Weather Service back in the spring, and the media reports about how some of them were treated with insurance and things like that. Are people going to be beating down the door to come work for the federal government, even now that they're hiring again? It's going to be really interesting to see.
Yeah, that's pretty upsetting to think about. And I would have liked to have caught that public radio forum. I try to feel like I am giving all of the information when I talk to people, but when it comes to the radar, I almost I know that it's more complex than this, but I want to say, so do you know what the radar that we're using for weather right now is called? It's called WSR 88. Do you know what the 88 stands for? It stands for 1988, the year 1988. Now, again, I know that there have been improvements and evolution and all that, but I don't think the average person would be too impressed to hear that we're finally getting like on the verge of a new generation of technology, especially that could be so helpful for severe storm forecasts and warnings and also things the public cares about, like aviation and all of that. I almost just want to like boil it down as far as like, you want to keep using the radar from 1988, and that if it's this stuff is going to be like air traffic control, right? Like it's, no one is going to pay much attention until something bad happens. And we kind of saw that with the collision between the airline flight and the helicopter in DC, and we saw it some after the Texas floods. But when you're talking about the long range stuff, it's you're not going to be able to 5 years from now, we're not going to be able to easily point to, oh, this event that wasn't forecast as well as it could have been. If only back in 2025 we had, continued to fund whatever. We won't know if it is because someone less experienced was on duty, because a more experienced person had been cut or decided to leave. We won't know if it's because the sharpest young undergraduate in the meteorology program, at OU or Penn State or wherever has decided, that public service is too fraught with uncertainty. And so I don't know. That's, again, I'm a fan of your newsletter because I feel like you're putting a spotlight on this, and it's great to hear when I hear something like CNN might do some sort of segment on it. One thing that keeps me going to try to keep getting the word about my book out there. Obviously, I'm an author. I want people to read the book, but also I just, I want it to be a resource for people at this time. I keep thinking, I wish I had the budget to send a copy to every, U.S. senator and every, congressperson's office, and, hope that, look, if 1 out of 10 people skimmed it, it would still be, additive, other than some of the, the key people in the legislature that I think do understand the weather world. But, that is not the majority.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's it is frustrating from that perspective, in that, when I was in MIC, I would occasionally interact with the congressional delegation from Mississippi. That's, I was MIC in Jackson. Yep. And obviously for the most part it was Republican, and they were always very supportive. And that has pretty much been my experience. I've probably engaged more with congressional delegations since I've been at the lab, and that's part of going into this second Trump administration. I was pretty confident that it was going to be a much rougher road than the first go around. So that doesn't surprise me, but it does surprise me, as you said, how little pushback there's been, especially considering that this is an area where I know that there are a lot of Republican congressional, both on the Senate and the House side, who, are interested in this and have strong desires to get some things done. And I mean, I guess I shouldn't be that surprised when you're looking at medical research being decimated the way it is, and there being very little pushback about that. But it is still, that's the part, like you said, that has really kind of taken me aback.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that there is really any underlying public support for reducing our funding of cancer research, but yet our representatives seem to be behaving as if there is not that public support. And it is a time when people I'm trying not to look at this through a super partisan lens. I really believe, like with the exception of the extent to which I think some bad actors have chosen to politicize weather because they've already politicized climate, and well, logically then you kind of have to politicize weather as well. But outside of that, I think your average person, whether they are a Democrat or a Republican voter, I think they want good weather forecasting. Right. I really do. but if this were the only thing that were going on, maybe it would be possible for it to, to get some focus on it. But I could do a whole nother conversation again as a one-time Wall Street Journal reporter. Federal Reserve independence is going to be an enormous story,
Right.
in the coming months, and another one that is not easy to tell to the general public, but one with enormous stakes for
Right.
For the general public. And that's, there's no end of each of these: the medical research, the Fed, NOAA's research, the general concern I have on, I guess, we already knew there were attacks on science, but now there's kind of this attack on data. And I think in the weather world, we're seeing it on, oh, well, this data may indicate something about the climate that is not politically convenient, but just in general, more data, more data.
Usually more data is a good thing. Yeah.
We're starting to see, even attacks on, gathering the information, whether that's the economic that, I was shocked.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
When I forget who it was speaking for the White House was saying, like, well, maybe we'll only put the jobs data out every 3 months instead of every month. And I used to sit at a desk at the Dow Jones News Service where, every time a piece of economic data came out, we would watch the screens and, look at what was happening in the market as investors digested this news. And, investors depend on data. Sorry, I'm going off in a very business direction, but it's
I actually think it's very relevant, because I think we're seeing it in weather data and climate data as well. I mean, there was this push. Luckily, they, with pressure, it got resolved. But there was this push to defund the regional climate centers back a few months ago, and they're not funded again in the 26 president's budget, and they're you talked about investors relying on the economic data. I mean, the number of businesses and agricultural interests and all rely on being able to
insurance.
You're right, and what they're going to do if they have reduced access to this kind of data it's difficult to understand. Well, we've probably only got a few more minutes. Let's wrap up with something a little more fun. So I'm
yeah,
curious.
Really, I was like, wow.
Really, but I mean, it's our world. I mean, it is what it is. So I'm curious as to what in your, you talked about that you tried to get out and get into the the field, whether it was hanging out with my friend Sean Waugh on storm chasing, or so I was really interested in some of what you did in the heat chapter, going out with some of the folks that were heat chasing for I mean, what were some of, I mean, if you could just pick one or two of the experiences that you found most interesting or most concerning,
Well, I mean, look, I'm not gonna lie. Storm chasing was definitely, and getting to go with Sean Waugh, that you mentioned, was really exciting. And actually, I had, back when the first Twister movie came out, which was 98. I have a hard time remembering that. I tried to get there was always a little thing going on at the Journal of, can you get your editor to let you do a story that's like not really on your beat? I was trying to persuade my editor. I was like, The rise of mobile internet means that the storm chasers can access more data when they're in the field. And I had
You're
I had
right
talked to
about that.
somebody who was going to let me ride along or whatever. This was literally almost 20 years ago, and it was like no, no sale. We're not. Don't book
I
your
think they
flight
missed an
to
opportunity.
to Oklahoma. So it was kind of like the and uh one of my good friends from the newsroom back then who had followed this whole thing. When she saw the book, she was like, "You finally did it." It took you
Right.
it took you almost 2 decades, but you finally got your storm chase story. I will say more seriously, I think what I found then so fascinating actually about the experience was realizing the amount of data that can be gathered out in the field, and how valuable this is. And again, I think maybe some of the public image of storm chasing, even though I think both of the movies try to stress that science is the goal, but there's also on social media is filled with
Oh yeah.
storm chasers who are basically chasing the video. They're chasing, the they're chasing the images that are going to go viral. And so to really get to see the science at work and the data collection at work, and I've been keeping up with Sean and the work he's done on, and the his colleagues there have done on the Hale camera,
Right.
as like, okay, now we can. And I just like, what a just how great is it to get to work on a puzzle like that? Like, okay, we want to measure the hail that's coming down as we're driving through the storm. How do we solve that problem? So in many ways, that was a great experience. But like I said, the time I spent at the ECMWF, where you're basically in an office building, but the vibe of it being a little more akin to a college campus. And I was fortunate when I was an undergrad, for a journalism project that we were doing at our college paper. I got to visit Bell Labs when it was still Bell Labs. And that thing of colleagues interacting and the discussions that are going on at the coffee machine or in the cafeteria or wherever, being sort of at the heart of collaboration. I really enjoyed getting to just be a fly on the wall at the ECMWF for the time that I spent there, and sitting in on meetings, but also getting to pick a table in the cafeteria and sit down and get on the edge of conversations. I feel like this is one of the nerdier things that I could describe as being that fun. And then also, I mean, look, basically any chance I had to go see something out in the world, especially having spent kind of the first year of my research in the pandemic era, doing mostly Zooms with people. Any chance I had to get out, I took. So, when Lockheed Martin said, do you want to come see the GOES satellite before we move it to the Cape, see it in the clean room, I was like, great.
Yes.
And as kind of a space geek from way back, getting to go in the clean room and see this amazing machine. I think that's where the optimism has to come from, right? Is we are able to build a satellite that can go up and see the lightning from above. We are able to, you know, we're able to figure out the equations that predict the behavior of the atmosphere. You know, I try to never lose sight at a very high level throughout the whole project that, you know, at some level, weather forecasting is, it's literally looking into the future.
Right.
And you know, I think the public image of, oh, the weather forecaster is always wrong. Oh, you know, they don't know what it's really going to be. And you know, to know through research how wrong that cliche is, and then to just kind of marvel, you know, if you look at the progress in hurricane track forecasts, and again, we all know there's more work to be done, and we know, you know, the intensification problem seems to be getting, you know, actually harder thanks to you know, thanks to the climate. But you know, it's kind of magical to think, wow, we have actually figured out how to look into the future of one of the most complicated systems we can think of in our natural world. You know, I think the fact that we can do that has to be a source of optimism for the future. And you know, whether it's here in the US or whether it's in Europe or whether it's in China, you know, I wish it was getting more notice that some of the important AI work for meteorology is coming out of China. You know, is that really what Fox News wants the future to to be, that the US is not the
Right.
leader in this? But anyway, the potential for progress is so enormous. I hope that excites people. And again, you know, selfishly as an author, I'd like more people to buy my book, but taking my author hat off and, you know, just, you know, kind of as somebody who loves science,
Right.
you know, I wish you know, I want to get more people to read it. I hope, and I appreciate your interest, because I've been hoping a little that the more word of it works its way through the world of meteorology,
Right.
you know, maybe people like you aren't going to find that much ultimately surprising in it, but you know, for your friends or family who are, you know, maybe skeptics or don't really understand your work, whatever, you know, I'm hoping there will be some propagation that way that will get people to really go, wow, this work is this the, the jobs that these people do are pretty amazing.
Well, and part of the reason, I mean, you know, before I knew that any of this stuff was going to be, you know, the stuff that we've spent a lot of time talking about over, you know, the last 6 months, before I knew any of that was going to be going on, and I thought about doing a blog or something like that whenever I retired, it was more with the idea of telling the story of the science and the research, and because you said something that I try to stress, you know, like when you're talking, you know, like you said, when I'm talking to a skeptic or a family member who doesn't get it, you know, we're predicting the future. And when I think about the level at which we could predict it when I started in this field in 88, you know, when the Dopplers were being developed, to today, it's amazing. I mean, it really is. It's really a triumph of human science. And that's, you know, that's, and just so you know, I mean, there was plenty, I even as somebody that's been in the field for 35 years, that I learned, you know, about, like, fire weather is not something that I've spent a lot of time in. So I really, you know, I really particularly enjoyed that section. But you know, it's a story that needs to be, you know, there's so much of science, you know, in physics and medicine, you know, that uh, is appreciated by society, I just kind of have the sense that weather forecasting is kind of taken for granted, and it really is a triumph of modern science.
I'm with you. I mean, that's what kind of kept me going through. They in the writing world, the axiom is sort of, don't start working on a book unless it's a subject that you're deeply interested in, because you're going to be steeped in it for for a couple of years, and if you don't find it that engaging, you're gonna run into a problem. And I never stopped finding it more interesting. In fact, I remember one of the conversations that really kind of pushed me even harder, to get this into a book, was visiting OU and talking to some of the people who were working on Vortex Southeast, and Kim Klockow McLean,
Right.
I'm sure and when I started to appreciate kind of how recent the efforts to bring social science to bear as a kind of force multiplier for the physics and the actual forecasting output, and okay, how can we take this really good forecast and get people to use it more effectively? How can we make sure that people can understand the forecast? And I was like, this is, I'm always looking for news as a news. I was like, oh my God, this is, this is relatively in the the time scale of how long we've been doing serious meteorology. This is like a relatively new serious development, and again speaks to that thing that always kind of gets me going, which is like, how is this going to change society? How is it going to shape society? Can we get people to understand weather better and behave differently? And the Texas story was so tragic because all of us know how dangerous flooding is if you're adjacent to the weather world at all. But if you're not, I really think that if you haven't ever been close to fast rising water, you may not understand it in your gut. I grew up in Michigan, and when there's a tornado warning and you've gotten a glimpse of a funnel, you afterwards have that gut sense of like, okay, no messing, no messing around. And I think getting people to understand flooding before it's not too late, I mean, that alone is just a huge story.
And it's it's probably a good way to finish, that the social science, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that was something I actually had on my list and we just didn't circle to it. But that is one of the things that I'm most excited about, that the community has really embraced in the last decade or so, and with folks like Kim and Kenzie Krochik that works at the Severe Storms Lab, that they really have really taken the ball and run with that. And I'm hoping that that's an area that, regardless of what happens with some of this governmental stuff, that somehow we manage to maintain some focus on, because that's really, as I've continued to do this more and more, the physical forecasts are getting better, and that's where the gap, I think, really exists, is conveying to people and helping them to understand what the risk really means to them and how to personalize it. And so that's I'm glad you touched on that, talked about that in the book, and I think it's just so important.
Yeah, and I mean, when I was researching that, I found it exciting. I was like, oh my gosh, and actually we're gonna start figuring out how to get even better at making the right decisions, and to to think that that might also be at risk right now is but I think we all have to keep talking about it, and it's going to be hard because if, like I said, if you're doing cancer research right now, that in again, this should be easy. Who out there hasn't been touched
Exactly.
in some way through a family member or a friend, and wouldn't want to see the sort of incredible progress over the last couple of decades could continue. But maybe somebody needs to start figuring out how to tie all of this together into support for science. But
Right.
that's an abstract problem for and again, I know the problem as is someone trying to tell stories for a living, and you probably notice how much when I think of how many interviews I did with people doing amazing work and who are so interesting to talk to that I never was able to use in the book. I mean,
Right.
it's great, and people were generous with their time, and it helps me be smarter in what I'm writing. But the brain responds to story and narrative, right? And so as you probably could tell reading through, that's where a lot of my time goes into how can I tell a smaller story within this big story? How can I tell the story of the heat wave unfolding in a way that's kind of a linear narrative? We gotta start figuring out how to tell that story about science with a
Right.
capital S.
And I do think that that's something that scientists in general struggle with. Is there's
But
almost
I understand. Having worked on this whole thing, I can understand why they do, because I think if you're a scientist, you got to be like, well, how obvious?
right. Exactly. That's yes. Exactly. Exactly.
Like to say, oh, and I need to spend even more time explaining. I think it must feel counterintuitive to the scientific brain a lot, because the results, I think if
Should speak
idealistically
for
would speak for themselves.
Right.
So I'm sympathetic there.
Yeah. I mean, we had a director at the lab who would say, our science should speak for itself. Well, it should, but that's not how the world works.
Well, and especially
and we need to
as
figure that out.
it is not how the world works, particularly within the last decade and the rise of the extent to which people get their information from social media,
Right.
and in ever shorter doses. But also, I mean, I it's a problem I worry about for the future in terms of weather warning information, because
Sure.
look, obviously, I grew up when there's bad weather, you turn on the TV, and one of the local TV news meteorologists is a familiar face and a trusted voice, and those people are still out there all doing that work. But I mean, my kids are in their 20s. Do they reach for the TV? I mean, they will, because I kind of like, but
right.
If you're looking on, I don't know how much you've experienced this, but if you're on Facebook or TikTok now, I have seen these supposed weather videos that are just kind of like engagement bait, and they're clearly like AI. It'll be like some enormous wave, like with people on a beach running and things like that. We're fighting to get the right information out when we need more of it, and yet the landscape in which we're doing it is actually making it harder to do. I mean, it's not easy to get somebody to buy a book and read a whole book.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just, and there, you said that about your kids. I mean, I have, you know, two kids, early 30s, late 20s, and I don't even know if they have a way to watch local news. That's just not, that's not in their, you know, experience. And so, um, as they, as they become the dominant part of the economy, what is going to happen with local news and those sorts of things? There's a lot of challenges, that's for sure. Well, we've actually run a little over, but it's been a great conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time, Tom. Do you want to show the book again?
Yeah, I'll and if you're watching this later, in the playback, if you go to www.cloudwarriorsbook.com, you can find the information about the book and about me, and I have some pictures. There's some pictures from NSSL and other
cool.
places I've been up there as well. So great to have this conversation. I appreciate it, and like I said, I hope to. I've do all the things that book authors do, and I was fortunate to have it excerpted by the Wall Street Journal, my old stomping grounds, and that's great attention, but it's also kind of in a pretty crowded world, and so I really want to get the word out to people who are already interested in weather and meteorology, and so I really appreciate the chance to have this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. And I just speaking for this meteorologist, I really appreciate that you told the story and as compelling and effective way as you did. And I'm happy to do whatever I can, whatever little thing I can to try to get the word out there that people need to read this book. So thanks for taking the time.
You're very kind to say that. I appreciate it.
And thank you for what you said about balanced weather. I appreciate that as well. So, all right, well, we'll go ahead and wrap up this video. And thanks for those of you that were here live. And I know there'll be a lot more people watching it on playback. And we'll see you next time.
All right.
Thanks, Tom.